Hello there. So welcome everyone, and lovely to have you here. And we'll be getting some of our colleagues from different country locations on online. But thanks very much. This is our first in a series, our LEADX series, which is basically getting us all engaging and interacting on some of the kind of new forward-looking leadership issues that are key to influence what we need going forward. I was just explaining, and I will let me first introduce Dr. Otto Scharmer to you. Many of you, actually he doesn't need introduction to many of us, but I think if I just say Theory U, most of you who follow this work would know the author behind Theory U, and Dr. Scharmer now heads the MIT U Lab and has written countless, something like 15 or more books translated in many languages on this issue. We were just discussing that the concept that he really made famous of presencing and looking ahead, you know, and really preparing our thinking, our leaders, our learning to almost learn from the future, to see what's coming and to be able to really take that on and absorb that and respond and proactively innovate to take on these challenges and opportunities is pretty much exactly what we're all looking for right now. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege after having studied Theory U and read many of these books to have Otto with us in person to lead off this series. So we will be also recording these series as a series of podcasts that we can then share online and really have many of our country team colleagues and RCs also engage on that. I do want to say thank you very much to Sarmad and Anifoda for the work they've put into this to make it happen. And as I said, this is just the first in a series of these engagements. So without much ado, let me just hand to Sarmad for a few words on how we're going to manage this, and then Sarmad will facilitate the to and fro going forward. We will also be joined by Achim Steiner, who's across the street and will come in, and we will adjust accordingly as Otto and Achim know each other, and we'll be able to work that in. Sarmad?
Thank you, Connie. The format for this LEADX and this conversation, this exchange, will be we do welcome some questions throughout the presentation. We'll leave it to Professor Scharmer and Otto to see how, at what point he may take questions. But those of you who are online, you can send in your questions to us. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the 2 hours we have you for this exchange. So do send them through to us, and we'll make sure that they're presented to the appropriate speaker and to Otto so we can address them. So we'll curate them and we'll consolidate them and share them. So that will be the flow for those of you colleagues who are joining online, as well as those of you in the room. Please put up your hand. We'll take note of it, we'll nod, and then we'll manage the flow of questions, a mix of those online and those from the room as well. Hope that's clear? Good? Okay.
Otto,
all right, we're in your hands.
All right, thank you.
Over to you.
Connie, Sarmad, so thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me being here. Good afternoon here in New York, good morning and good evening in all the other locations that are also joining us. I will be sharing a little bit from my own experience in dealing with cross-sector innovation and change, and put that to the discussion, and look forward to learn from your experiences, how you're dealing with that, and maybe explore possibilities. When you look at this picture here, that basically summarizes the situation that, I'm sure you have seen, I have seen in many countries I go to. When you talk to teams at the top, when you talk at, on the community, on a grassroots level with leaders, with change makers today, now, what is it that people, conveying to you? Basically, everyone feels the same, which is that we live in a moment of disruption, where we all pretty much know that the future will be significantly different from the past. So you could say, if you go to this picture here, to the left-hand side, kind of current reality is on one side. And then on the right-hand side, we have like, we know a little bit about this, can agree on some things. That's already less clear, right? Kind of what's the emerging future? We agree less on that already. But what's least clear for sure is how to move from here to there. So that journey and that, what actually is the process? How do you innovate in the face of disruption? And that's kind of the question that has been organizing my own research, and with research I mean action research, kind of practical experiments over the past 15 plus years. So I want to share some of these experiences. Now, talking about disruption, here are the three responses that I believe we see across all countries, across all sectors, across all systems, particular in the public debate. What are the three responses? The first one is same old, right? Downloading. So basically, now the future is an extension of the past, right? You modify it a little bit left or right, kind of, but it's basically continuing. Now, if we go to last year's election here in the United States, the face of that, of course, Hillary Clinton, right? So in the past, that has been for the establishment the recipe of success. If we look at the elections, the most recent elections in most places, particularly Europe, no longer. What's the second response we see? A much more radical response that says the system is broken and we need to drain this one. So in this case, there are two versions of that. Right? In this case, it's based on ignorance, hate, fear, which is another word of saying closing the mind, closing the heart, and closing, kind of hardening the will, right? Wrapping our identity around experiences of the past. And what are the behaviors we see? Denial. There are 5 behaviors, right, that comes with this kind of response that we see. The first one is denial. What's an example here from the United States? We are hit by one worst ever hurricane after another. And what's the conversation we are not having? Climate change. We have more than one mass shooting per day. For the past few years, what's the conversation we are not having? Gun laws. So that's what denial looks like on a societal level, right? It's amplified by the politics of lying. 1,318. That's the number of false and misleading statements by President Trump by mid-September. So it's about 5 per day. You can fact check that with the Washington Post site. The second behavior is desensing. And desensing basically means not being able to sense what you say and do does to the other person, right? So you're not kind of getting inside, you cannot feel. So it's the inability to empathize. So that's, of course, our current president here is a living embodiment of that, but Trump is not the problem, he's the symptom. And the problem is something much more structural here, which has to do with digital media, kind of with social media. As you all know, with echo chambers, as you all know, kind of during the parts of the final stage of the election cycle last year, more shares of fake news than shares of real news sites in Facebook, and so on and so forth, right? Dark posts, micro-targeting, all these things. You know about them already. So, number 3, me first, right? It's a mindset. that is basically in denial of the interdependency, right? You can say, right? It creates problems here, right? And yesterday, I grew up in Germany. Kind of, why did the new German government fail? Me first, right? Thanks to the FDP, right? Kind of who demonstrated kind of how, in a moment where we really need a little bit stability for all the obvious reasons, me first is always good for disrupting that. And then blaming others. So it's building up walls, basically. Architectures of separation, right? So blaming others means the inability to reflect, to look at your own part in the situation. And therefore arguing a discourse of us versus them, and promoting like architectures of separation, one way or another. Leading to destruction, right, of trust, of international institutions, right, of the planet, like the Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth, including the implosion of the social security here in the United States. All the effects. It's basically everything the UN is standing for is, under attack. And it's not just Trump. It's not just the far right. It's not just kind of the Russian government and far-right US billionaires funding this stuff. It's something that it's happening on a larger scale in many countries today. So that's kind of a phenomenon we see in many different faces. Sometimes we call it like fundamentalism, sometimes we call it something else. But so these 5 behaviors that I just mentioned here, we see on a far larger scale than limited to the US at this point. So that's number 2, the second response. What's the third response? It is basically saying, yes, the system is broken, but rather than turning backwards, orienting ourselves in the past, we need to lean forward. But if you deal with disruption and you try to lean forward, what is it kind of that you're required to do? It only works if you can activate these 3 capacities: curiosity and listening, compassion and empathy, and letting go and courage. So it's kind of these deeper capacities that are required. So in my view, the phenomenon kind of Trumpism, if we say kind of that's kind of the phenomenon we saw amplified the last couple of years. Why? We know there are some political reasons, right? We know there are some economic reasons. But what's the third reason? Massive educational failure. Because if you deal with disruption, and if you do not have these capacities, guess what happens? You're thrown into this space. So that would be kind of my analysis kind of the current. 3 responses to disruption. And what's our job? Our job is basically developing these capacities at scale. My last upfront remark before inviting us into the first round of conversation is, okay, so let's look at the drivers for disruption. So what is it kind of we're actually dealing with today? And we know that kind of digitization is a major force that is kind of plowing through all the different industries, through all the societies. But what else? And this is kind of a framing I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, that I have liked to use to summarize kind of on the symptom level kind of the challenges we are dealing with. The ecological divide, the social divide, and the spiritual divide. So the ecological divide, I will be very brief. You know everything around that. Actually, you know much more than I about that, right? It's what's the one number that summarizes the ecological divide? 1.5, right? We use 1.5 planets, resources in the amount of 1.5 times the regeneration capacity of planet Earth. Social divide, what's the number? 8. 8 people owning as much as half of mankind combined, right? So that's kind of a measure for inequity. And then the ecological divide basically arises from a disconnect between self and nature. The social divide essentially arises from a disconnect between self and other. But the spiritual divide arises essentially from a disconnect between self and self, between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow. So if those two selves are not well connected, you know, it feels, what does it look like, feel like? Loss of energy, kind of symptoms of burnout, anxiety, depression, and in extreme cases, even risk for suicide. 800,000 people, right, according to WHO in 2010, killed themselves, which is more than people died through war, murder, and natural disasters combined. So in spite of all the violence going on in the world, more people kill themselves than are being killed through others. And that's maybe the most shocking of all these numbers. So that means, from a systems perspective that we apply here on these issues, what are we dealing with? We deal with a system where we collectively create results that nobody wants. Example, 1.58 and 800,000. No one gets up in the morning and says, and today I want to destroy more world, I want to, you know, inflict violence on others, and structural violence, and I want to increase my own level of unhappiness. No one. Yet, that's collectively what we do. And that's exactly kind of the deeper systems question. So what are the deeper layers of this iceberg that brings us together here? So I want to invite you into a little kind of reflection moment and conversation by showing you a short evocative video clip. Actually, this first one is actually a little longer. It takes you on a journey and kind of will move from there into the first round of conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey of the next few minutes. Oh, so I forgot one thing. The 17 SDGs, just to say the obvious, of course, can be grouped according to these three problems, right? So 1 through 10 is kind of the social divide, the people that I mentioned, and then 11 through 15, the ecological divide. And you could say, you could make the case kind of that the last two are more kind of dealing with the deeper foundations, right, of how we work together. So, all right, interestingly. Interestingly, the clip isn't working. So let me just go over. So let's not try to, maybe by magic it happens the next moment.
It's spiritual.
All right, so let's just, I will just keep on going. So and I will then also move past this one. So it's basically, we'll make the clip available to you also online otherwise. It's basically something that, it's a journey kind of that talks about really turning around the camera, kind of from the viewpoint of the astronauts who went into space. It's like an evocative clip that invites us into the space of really turning the camera back, not only on planet Earth, but also on planet Self as leaders. And that's pretty much, you could say, kind of the core shift that you try to do from a systems point of view when you deal with systems and when you deal with leaders, that you make the system sense and see itself, kind of that you turn around the camera and begin to look at kind of some of the deeper foundations that we collectively enact. So let me directly go to another clip, which actually gives you a little tour through, the place that I'm coming from, which is MIT. And so what you see here is the main building of the MIT campus. And it is kind of it's built 100 years ago, 1916. And it's the embodiment of everything that's wrong with learning and leadership today. So I want to take you on a little tour because, it shows you kind of some of the mechanics And it also gives you, introduces you that in the midst of these old structures, right, that really look like yesterday's paradigm in many ways, something very new and very exciting is emerging and happening. And I'm sure a lot of that is applicable to the structures and organization forms you're working in as well.
When they built this campus, they had a very clear idea of ordering. At the top level, the library, abstract knowledge. Below that, math, then physics, then applied sciences. And in the basement, you had mining and metallurgy. We are now on the top level of the building, right under the dome. The library is still here. Some things, however, have changed. When you look around, you see most of the books have faded into the background, into the neighboring rooms. And today, most of the reading takes place right here at the computer screen. So technology has changed, but the old order is still in place. Wherever you are in the world, if you went to school, a setup like this probably will look familiar to you. The teacher up front talking, students sitting in neat rows listening. Education today is going through a moment of profound disruption. What's ending and dying is an old model of education that works through classrooms like this, through lecturing and listening. What's being born is a new model of education that works to learn by doing. Here are 3 principles that we believe will be at the core of the 21st century university and that we would like to prototype with you in this MOOC over the next few weeks. Number 1, taking the learning from the classroom into the streets, linking hand in hand. MIT has always been a great place for linking hand in hand, but over the past decade or so, we have seen major educational innovations that take students out of the classroom into the streets in order to engage with the real world. Look around. MIT is a really small place, just a few buildings, just a few people. And yet, the impact of this place in its community has been quite significant. For example, the combined revenue of companies founded by MIT graduates is surpassing $2 trillion. It would make it the 10th largest economy in the world. And it's an amazing example of the power of entrepreneurship, which really is the power of linking the head and the hand. What we believe is that the next evolutionary step of this power is to link the head and the hand with the intelligence of the heart. Most young people I know across cultures actually aspire to do the same thing, to use their entrepreneurship and their creativity in a way that's connected to their passion and in a way that makes the world a better place. So the second principle here is about linking the power of entrepreneurship with passion and with compassion, which is the intelligence of the heart. The third principle is about self-knowledge. What is self-knowledge? Self-knowledge essentially is an inquiry into the 2 root questions of creativity, which are, who is myself and what is my work? Who is myself means, what is my highest future possibility? What is my work means, what is the future that I want to be a part of in my journey forward? This transformation from the old university with abstract knowledge at the top and applied knowledge at the bottom to the new university with self-knowledge at its core also requires us to evolve the concept of science from only looking at external data to also exploring the more subtle aspects of our experience by bending the beam of scientific observation back onto the observing self. ULab invites you on such a journey of reflection and renewal.
So what this clip is basically talking about is two transformations that I believe are revolutionizing the space of learning and leadership today. One is shifting the outer place of learning from the classroom to the real world, right? And there's a whole kind of bunch of things going on around that. And the other one is shifting the inner place of learning from the head to the heart and from the heart to the head. So if you put these two things together, what's the new environment, right, that we need to create for learners and for leaders, kind of, in order to develop these deeper capacities? And what I want to say is, with this clip is, it probably, if we build this environment in you, it probably wouldn't look like this, right? It wouldn't look like this where you sit in windowless, lecture halls inside this dome. But it would kind of open up the dome, kind of, and it would kind of, yes, it would create a space, but would allow the learner to kind of more freely move inside and outside, and to go through a cycle kind of where you're engaged in the real world and change and learning and kind of societal renewal processes, and then go back to spaces of reflection and renewal and kind of capturing knowledge and acquiring new tools around this. So it would be kind of a different kind of learning environment, which is exactly what we see going on. So you can apply that to the individual, but if you apply that on an institutional level, I also, find when you work with organization across sectors, there is not a single sector today, and government is no exception, in which kind of you can address the major leadership challenges that we face today in this space by just this one organization, right? In all these cases, we need to bring together multiple stakeholders across multiple sectors that need each other to change the system. And then you need to move these leaders from one way of seeing the world and operating, which is kind of a silo view, more to a systems view. Or you could, bring in kind of a slightly different language. You need to move them from an ecosystem awareness, where you just look at the problem from your own institutional angle, to an ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is operating, or that is focusing on the well-being of all, and not only on the well-being of a few, including kind of the most marginalized. So with that, transformation of the architecture of learning and leadership that we are in the midst of, I want to give you now 2 or 3 minutes just kind of to turn to your neighbor and to share a little bit, given the challenges that you face in your job and in your part of the organizations, where do you see something like that? Where do you see kind of this transformation from, on the one hand, we have this old vertical or silo type of structures. On the other hand, we also, most of us, deal with the new leadership challenges that require us to basically activate the ecosystem of partners that often are not inside these silos, but that are surrounding our organizations and our organizational entities. So I want to give you kind of 2-3 minutes for that, and I also would like to welcome Achim, who has been thankfully joining us and will be also joining us kind of for the first part of the conversation.
And Rosemary, want to join us? Yes, please.
So why don't you take a minute or two kind of to just share a little bit your own angle on. So from silo to systems view, from ego to ecosystem, where do you see that going on in your own context? Looking at your own situation, kind of institutionally and kind of from your own leadership challenge, from this angle, what are you noticing? 2 or 3 examples. Could be also, online examples. I don't know how the voice comes in, kind of whether there's like an email channel or something, but maybe we start in the room here.
I'll start. I thank you very much for the presentation thus far. and we discussed a variety of things, but one of the key things I wanted to put forward was the element that you put forward on the need for curiosity, compassion, and courage for the paradigm to move forward in a positive manner. And we were discussing on what would that mean for us and for the RC system and for the whole UN reform agenda, especially the compassion and the heart part that you talk about as the element, not just the head to the hand, but to add the heart. How would we translate that, and how does that translate within our environment? And we actually admitted that at times, ruthlessness and stepping on those below you seems to be rewarded. So the question is how do we bring that in, and what would it take to bring compassion and heart into our leadership across the planet? So it's more of a rhetorical question, but a point I think that needs further pondering.
Thank you. Please.
We had a very interesting discussion here. We had a very interesting discussion with my colleague here, and we had it along a similar line. You know, when you think about where we're headed in the future, where we need to explore more of our minds and our hearts and entrepreneurship, that calls for a different kind of organizational culture. Perhaps it means a move to a less bureaucratic culture that seems to confine people in the way they think and what they can do and not do. And so that was a great observation that we made, that we have to really rethink organizational culture and how it supports that sort of thinking, given the future we are heading to.
Thank you. You had your hand?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, your eco perspective. Because, for instance, now in the UN we have this great opportunity to reform and change our ways. And I think we approach it very much in an ecosystem approach, where we're saying, so how can my organization benefit from this change? Where can I take my organization, perhaps? Where if we truly had that leadership that you're calling for, where we see it as an ecosystem, we would come together and look at it more system-wide. And what does the system need as the guiding light, and then you fit yourself into that. So I thought it was interesting to see our current reform approach through that perspective.
Thank you very much. I will, later on I will talk a little bit more about that and also give examples and also kind of specify enabling infrastructures for that. But maybe just also for Achim as a reference. When you talked about the compassion versus kind of the closing the heart, that was, I was, referencing in the beginning 3 responses to disruption that we see, right? Downloading the same old thing, right? Kind of in the election, like Hillary Clinton, right? Continuation of status quo. Then, no, the system is broken. We need to drain the swamp, right? 2 different versions. One is by orienting ourselves backward, right? Closing the mind, closing the heart. Hate us versus them, and hardening the will, and amplifying fear, right? Michael Moore, his summary, right, who predicted, of course, his summary of what happened: ignorance creates fear, and fear creates hate. That was his kind of 3, 1-sentence summary of what happened. And then the 3rd response, leaning into disruption. Connecting with disruption by leaning forward, not kind of moving backward, but leaning forward, which requires us to strengthen and cultivate these capacities: curiosity, compassion, and courage. And curiosity and listening, compassion, empathy, and courage, and the capacity of let go of the past. And those they need to be built. So from this perspective, you could say, the phenomenon of Trumpism in many different forms and of that we see today is not only due to political and economic factors. We know that. I mean, there are clearly these factors, but it's also the result of a massive educational failure, the failure of us to build leadership capacities and cultures that strengthen, that strengthen these skills, that allow us in the face of disruption to lean in and to move forward rather than kind of reverting into the past and moving backward. So that's certainly something I want to talk a bit later or more about, which is what actually can you do to strengthen these capacities and what are enabling infrastructures? Because that's, in my view, kind of the definition of leadership, right? To strengthen the capacity of the system to access these resources in the face of disruption. All right, with that, Achim, I want to invite. I'm really so happy you could make it at all. Kind of join us for a few minutes. I know you have to move out for another urgent meeting in just a few minutes. So I would like to hand it over to you to any kind of guidance and remarks, and maybe situate kind of this larger topic of kind of cross-sector leadership and how we build the capacities for that in the current moment, kind of that really. We are living in as a global community, but also kind of as the UN community that was never more in history needed, right, as a functioning organism than at this point.
Powerful words, Otto. First of all, it's lovely to see you here and to have somebody with your global audience, and I have visited Otto in his lab and at the university probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, to invest time here. And I think if there's one thing that I would say to you is you have not wasted your time, because this United Nations, this idea is more needed than ever, and it is particularly so now. And yet what you're partly addressing yourself to is, I think, the phenomenon that we are all being challenged by our Secretary General, by our clients, by the media, by the cynics, and by the skeptics, which is that this idea of the United Nations still is beautiful, and everybody, in a sense, supports it passively. This is interesting. Even US opinion polls, support the idea of the United Nations and the US being engaged in it. Young people, think the UN is the ultimate sort of global brand in terms of an idealism about how we live together and what should happen in the world. And yet we, who sit in this room here, are part of this cast of people who have somehow turned this idea upside down. And it's putting it a little bit extreme, but we are the bureaucrats, we are the Unocrats, the high-earning, non-tax-paying, non-parking ticket-paying people who hang around New York, cause traffic jams, and do what? So there is a disconnect, and that disconnect in part, I think, can be described in that broader moment in time in which we are living right now. Our colleagues who are online and working in countries are already one step away from that cynicism and skepticism that sort of centers itself around the belly button of the UN, which happens to be the headquarters here, and the Security Council and the General Assembly and the political divisions. So if you're in the field, you're already one step removed from that. But if you listen to the reform narrative right now, actually it's the field that is the biggest problem, because they seem to be all over the place, not working with each other, stepping on each other's toes, chasing money, and the bigger the elbows, the more successful you are. And I thought what you were saying just now, what was the word you used about?
Ruthlessness?
No, but what you do in the process?
Step on those below you.
Yeah, well, it was something that had an in, thankfully, and not another ending, which would have meant that it's deliberate, right? So I forgot the verb now.
Yeah.
But just to say, Otto, I think what you're addressing at the moment is, I think, very elegantly capturing this notion of an ecosystem and an ecosystem. And what the Secretary General is saying right now, it's not that people in the system are, lazy or somehow not doing their job, but what we're doing is missing the point in part, and therefore we need to rethink the system. And the first thing that happens in a federated system like ours is that, the calculation is not, what will be the outcome in the sense of improvement, but rather what is the risk to me to lose something? Because everybody right now has got something to lose. The ones on the outside, no, they've either lost or never had something to gain. But those who are inside the system, it is where we are with us, the employees of the UN, we think we have a lot to lose from change, and for what? An uncertain outcome. It could be better, it could be worse. I think the first thing that, in going back to your graphic here also, that I think is critical in the kind of mentality with which we approach change, is that it has something to do with ourselves. And yes, therefore attitude becomes very important, and curiosity, compassion, courage, the sort of attributes that you allude to here that allow you to, moving from being a cynic or a skeptic, an observer, somebody who is passive. By being passive, you're more excluded, more alienated, and this is not only the guys out there who appear on television news in the evening. There are a lot of people inside the system who fit that description. They, in part, don't understand why the system is doing certain things. I think fear about one's own future. And then sometimes, well, hatred may seem strong, but, I've seen hatred inside this organization between people. And it's, to me, stunning. And part of that has to do with that other part that you refer to, the ecosystem. There are very few people who join the United Nations without having some kind of passionate personal reason to send that application in at the time. The public thinks that we are the highest earning people on the market. Actually half the people inside the UN could earn 3 times as much in the private sector without batting an eyelid. So it's not the money. It's actually a lot of people join the UN because of the idea of the UN. And then something happens. And it's not unique to the UN. Bureaucracies kind of put more and more distance between where you think you would like to be and do things and where the daily reality actually asks you to work. And that's the first sort of point of, alienation or distancing. And the next point, I think, comes where essentially the incentives around us are such that we're actually led to behave in a way that we ourselves don't think is the right way, but is rational under current conditions. And that's probably the most insidious reality in bureaucracies, because we turn people who are assets, motivated, identifying with the ideal of the organization through a personal experience of working in it, into increasingly frustrated, alienated people. Now, some of you might say, I'm not frustrated, I'm not alienated. Why are you describing UN staff as, being in such a dark place? No, because it's not a matter that you are 24/7, 365 days a year sitting and think, isn't it awful? No. It's a kind of, almost subcutaneous reality. It doesn't manifest itself in coming in the morning and holding up a sign saying, I hate the place I work. It's more the sort of, no, I'm not going to take that risk. They didn't take that risk. I'm not going to take it. Let somebody else take the responsibility for this. Deferral of risk-taking, because you talk about courage. We suffer from a lack of courage in the institution because we actually don't reward courage. We punish courage very often because we don't encourage management of risks. We actually reward the avoidance of risks. I mean, just to give you another example of what happens in our daily reality. And so, in that sense of presencing, I think there is an element that has to do with us as individuals, but a significant amount of it actually has to do with the incentives we are given to believe the story. Because behind this, as an employee in an organization, is always a story. If you do A, B, C, and D, you will get E or get to E or whatever E might be. And the truth is that that equation is not always obvious in our incentivization here. And it goes beyond the individual, because part of the reform that we're trying to address right now in the UN is this phenomenon of how we end up sometimes with 25, 30 organizations working in a country, which in itself, I would argue, is not good or bad, because the country may know why it wants 30 different parts of the UN servicing its needs. But to do it in a way that almost doesn't know who the other 25 are, maybe we know 5, having an army of vehicles parked outside offices that, in a sense, is irrational in terms of expenditure, operating in a mode where, vis-a-vis those who fund our work, we often end up being competitors rather than working as a UN system. You add all that together and you begin to understand why we have a problem and why we have a reform process. And I hope, Otto, in part through the experience that you have also had with many other, corporate organization, but also social realities, because in the end we're all social systems also that are working together, that you can help us rediscover a little bit of that courage that actually gives rise to letting your passion play out, compassion as well, and to trigger the curiosity in, well, could we actually do things differently? And do we have the courage to take the risk to try it? And do we find ourselves in a place where we actually rediscover that inspirational part of why we actually ended up here, which is that this is an amazing idea that has not just remained an idea, it's an expression of an entire generation that saw the abyss, and out of that created this idea of the United Nations, and those of us who are today employed by it are actually in an extraordinary, not privileged, I wouldn't even refer to it as privileged, but in an unfortunate position that we actually are part of this idea. And that if only we can, in a sense, move our own institution with the times and learn some of the lessons and shed some of the sting of bureaucracy, we still are a very precious gift to the world if we can make it work. And I hope that some of what you have uncovered over the years, both with your presencing approach, and I haven't yet read the new book on ecosystems and ecosystems, but I can sense some of what might be in there, and I'm very intrigued. So, colleagues, both here in New York but also online, you have a really remarkable person here with you today, who is much humbler than he needs to be, because he's actually triggered thinking and ideas across the world that many of us would be very proud if he came close to it. So Otto, back to you, and thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. Also, thank you for really role modeling much better than my words can do. What presence in leaders can do to a situation, right? So the way you talked and the way you address kind of real problems, not in a way of accusing yourself or others, but describing it, and yet doing it in an open-hearted way, in an open-minded way, creates a different atmosphere, creates a different space of thinking. So the way we are together now is, if you really pay attention to that, different than before Achim spoke. Because if a leader is here and is talking in that way about issues, what does it do? It changes the space. And it also creates permission to be a little bit more real. Right? Bring a little bit more in what we really think in a conversation. In other words, making the conversations we have in teams, in meetings, in stakeholder situations, a little bit more real and relevant to what we deal with as an organization vis-a-vis our key stakeholders. So I want to also really express my appreciation of you really embodying that better kind of than my not so articulate words can do. And it struck me kind of the way you described really the situation here in the UN. So yes, it's true. Kind of it was the generation that looked into the abyss and came up with an idea, with a kind of intention actually, kind of that took us a generation plus, right? Kind of that took us like half a century plus. And now is the time that we see, I would say not only one abyss, but we see at least three, right? I mentioned the ecological, the social, and also the spiritual divide, which has to do with, the question, who are we as human beings, right? And kind of the, what's really the future we want to be part of, and we want to be co-shaping. And I think we are exactly kind of in the same moment, kind of where we need to really kind of now set the intention for the next cycle, right? Be that 50 years or be that, a little longer or less, but, that kind of gives us kind of direction. And when you, talking about this dynamic here, what strikes me, and I'm sure that's kind of for many kind of, particularly those out in the field kind of who are joining us remote, but also for everyone really here in headquarters. What is it? What's the reality we see? When you go around today, right, we see a lot of this, right, kind of the presencing cycle, or the lower cycle here, the cycle of co-creation. And we also see a lot of kind of this blue stuff here, right, kind of the upper half of the picture, which is really the cycle of essentially destruction and self-destruction. And a lot of that is evident today, right? In all organizations, and particularly if you go to the field, the more you go local, kind of the more you see the seeds of the new, right? But why is it then, when there is so much evidence for both, and we are connected to both of these ecosystems in a way, why is it that in the public awareness, in the public conversation, in the public consciousness, almost everything is dominated by the blue cycle? And very little awareness kind of to the yellow cycle. Why is that the case? And I think, and you know, and sometimes it feels like this thing, the blue space, is just kind of ever expanding and absorbing all the oxygen, right, of the public conversation, and there's kind of very little. And so I talked a little bit about kind of the unintentional use of technology in my opening remarks. But, you know, obviously, kind of one of the main factors is, so there's like dark money, right? That's one. But, you know, but also, a book that's kind of recommended, even though it makes you a little bit depressed, kind of, it talks about the intentional investment into an infrastructure, into this blue space, right? And among others, the climate denial industry, right? $550 million in 7 years invested, and result accomplished. So that's dark money, that's one. But there's another one here, which is media and social media, kind of basically amplifying the noise, right, as a noise amplification machine. And very little kind of intentional space when you look at how social media currently works, and also how the media news cycle works, kind of what is kind of better for advertising and so on. There's like, you know, no amplification mechanism for the seeds of the future that are already here, that are already existing, but that don't have the amplification mechanism that does exist for the blue space. I think that is one of the big leverage points. And that's actually something we can do a lot about, right? So what is missing? Not only like a new news media platform and, you know, social networks where you make visible all the positive stories, kind of where innovation, renewal, and where we kind of renew kind of the foundations of our economic and democratic and educational structures, but also where you blend that with free online to offline capacity building and movement building infrastructures. And that's actually kind of something we have prototyped for. You know, actually, after we met last time, there's actually kind of the first time where I see that kind of the activation of the deep learning cycle really can go to scale is something that over the past few years at MIT, kind of we prototyped under the headline of MIT ULab, MITx ULab. And it's an online to offline, learning platform. I will share a little bit about that a little later. But what it does is activates local communities at scale to a marginal cost close to zero. And that's the first time I have ever seen that. And the reason is kind of that there is a much higher capability and willingness on a local level to self-organize around these new spaces. And we have been, over the past few months, we have been teaming up with HuffPost. We'll be launching in March a new platform, an interactive multimedia hub that will make the new economic narrative about ecosystem economics and creating, basically kind of realizing the 17 SDGs. From marginal to mainstream, so it will highlight pioneers kind of these stories, and we'll blend that with capacity building mechanisms, kind of where these capacities of, how do you really deepen your capacity to listen? How do you really, create like platforms that have kind of a shared ownership and that, include all the different stakeholders and that encourage kind of new experiments, where that is being offered as a free online to offline capacity building mechanism. We'll launch that in March, and it just strikes me that it's very parallel to what you are trying to do kind of with the implementation of the 17 SDGs, and that could be kind of one of the areas where we could explore collaborative possibility, because what we already see going on is a lot of momentum, mostly from the civic, in part government, like the Scottish and the Dutch government kind of using these mechanisms for asset-based community development, but there could be kind of a lot more kind of strategic, intentional collaboration around that.
Otto, I just wanted to ask a question on using these platforms. We're getting some just feedback from some of our RCs who are very out there trying to move big kind of platforms, social media platforms, etc. What the pushback is very traditional local media that has captured the market, right? So no different, let's say, to Alabama. Yeah, I mean, and no one there is reading Huffington Post, for example. They're if at all, Fox Sports and the local group. So what are your because in some ways you've got to create the disruption to open up the space. And I mean, your work on the U-curve is that it's not a smooth ride. You have to lean in to the disruption, as you always say. And so it's in the work you've done, what has worked to lean in at those moments, to disrupt the traditional, if you wish, to bring in the new learning and the new thinking and the creativity.
Yes. Sorry. So you basically, we basically focus on where our sphere of influence, right? So and that was, in our case, creating these new learning environments, and you're then using technology, being at MIT, kind of being one of the innovators for the massive democratization and the access to knowledge. How can we blend these things together? And we are now moving more into the new news media space, because we learn, we are aware of this gap, that there's a lot of innovation going on the ground, and very little of that is kind of moving up to the public conversation, the public awareness. It's actually one of the biggest misgaps, and I think everyone who has been in the field and who knows the reality on the ground, and then how little of that is reflected in the larger public awareness often has an experience of that. So that is not going to shift all these problems and all these dynamics, but it's focusing on kind of where we have a sphere of influence. And in my view, the biggest problem is not the knowledge, of course, right? So we know everything already, right? It's the knowing-doing gap. And the knowing-doing gap is a question of capacity building. And that really, so I want to just share kind of a few examples that I mentioned kind of we have in our context. So so our own process of dealing. So we have run many experiments with multi-stakeholder groups, and how do you really take them on the journey from silo to systems view, or from ego system awareness to ecosystem awareness. And what we learned is basically 2 or 3 things. The first one is, what it takes is a process. You have to not only convene people, but you have to take them on a journey, right? A journey that goes through the stages of observe, 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 seeing the system from the edges, particularly through the eyes of the most marginalized. Retreat and reflect, kind of deep reflection practices, we could say more about that, and then kind of design thinking style, kind of learning by doing. Kind of you explore the future by doing something and generating feedback from others. That's the first thing we learn. Kind of it takes a process. And the second thing we learn is it takes inner leadership work. So here is kind of when I stumbled into that, kind of interviewing the late CEO of Hannover Insurance. Here's what he summarized his experience of leading, learning, and change for many years. He said, the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So let me translate. The success of what I do as a change maker depends on the inner state, the inner condition from that I operate. So it's the quality of my attention and intention that makes all the difference. So today, if you double click on what is this inner condition, what do we really mean by that? I would summarize that in terms of 3 domains, which is the open mind, and by that I mean the capacity to suspend your old habits of thought and judgment. The open heart, and by that I mean the capacity to empathize, to look at a problem through the eyes of another. And the open will, by which I mean the capacity to let go of the past and let come of emerging future possibilities. So what does that look like? And I want to, I know that there are some of the RCs are watching, from remote. And I think particularly for RCs, but also for others, one of the key skills, so everyone really who faces a network leadership challenge in their job, and that's actually most of us, right? So what is a network leadership challenge? To be successful in my job, depend on my capacity to make other people do something or change their behavior without having the hierarchy leverage to imposing. So how do I do that? Well, your capacity of listening is one of the key skills. So I want to, and I personally think that listening is probably the #1 most underrated capacity of leadership.
So we have an RC online with a question.
Okay.
We can Patrick.
So we have a question from an RC we just heard.
You gonna read it? Maybe they don't think listening is the skill.
No?
All right, so
I can read it out.
All right.
Yeah.
More and more people are recognizing the need for ecosystem awareness and need to transform how we work, but the pace and quality of system-wide transformation can only be generated through transformed leaders across systems at all levels. How do we generate that within existing frameworks? This is from Metzi.
All right.
McKenna from the RC Burkina Faso.
So excellent questions, and I would like to respond to that in 2 ways. First, by looking at a good example, because that having a concept, a differentiation, how do you learn to improve your quality of listening? Well, there's a conceptual pieces which is differentiating the different layers of listening, and then looking at a great example, right? Looking at master practitioners, but then of course creating infrastructures, how that can be applied in real world organizational development and stakeholder management situation. So I want to use the next few minutes to quickly exemplify that. So on the levels of listening, the first part of the answer is, so here are 3 different levels that we all are very familiar with. Listening 1 is downloading or recognizing. When you look at the right-hand side, it's downloading what you know. So on the right-hand side is the result, reconfirming what I already knew before. Whenever you're in a meeting, and whatever happens in the meeting is reconfirming what you expected to see, then you are downloading. So I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just 1 out of 4. And when you look at this drawing here, I hope that's visible also for the remote viewers. So let's say this circle, the blue circle, is the boundary of my organization as a listener. Then listening 1 is that the place from that I operate as a listener is really in the center of my own prison, right? So it's a closed room, all the curtains are down, I can't see what's outside. What I see, what I attend to is my own projections. It's what I already know, right? It's like the slides that I'm projecting onto the wall. It's not, it doesn't mean that your slides are good or bad. It's just 1 out of 4 different modes. So you attend to what you already know. That's kind of when you're in a closed room. Now, number two, if you look at the slide here, is, of course, factual listening, accessing the open mind. The result is you see something new. That's like this. You go, you stand up, you go to the window, you open the curtain, and you actually see what's going on outside, which is something different from what you expected to see. Now, that's okay, it's progress, but it's not good enough for those of us, particularly the RCs, who need to deal with, network leadership challenges. Two more are necessary. One is empathic listening, which makes us, the result here, see the situation through the eyes of another stakeholder, right? There's only one way how that works is by using your feelings, your heart, as an organ of perception, something that gives you information. So it's like this. Empathic listening is like this. My listening begins to happen from the place from where the other person is speaking from. I don't know whether, you can see that here. Let me put that so it's still visible, I think, for online. So it's visible. My listening happens from the place from where the other person is speaking from. Now, fourth level of listening is generative, and that means I connect to emerging future possibilities. So not only empathize with another person, but really, for example, when you meet a great coach, right? Kind of when a great coach would not only listen to me in terms of my suffering today, right? Kind of everything that's not working, but he or she would see me not only in terms of what's not working today, but the person I could step into tomorrow. So she would attend to my highest future possibility, who I could be tomorrow. And that's, of course, Nelson Mandela. That's kind of what great leaders have been doing on the level of countries or on the level kind of larger entities. So let me now show you a 2-minute example where a leader is moving through this journey, is shifting the situation by opening, by shifting the inner place in terms of the open mind, open heart, open will. So let me quickly do that. If I can operate that here. And that, maybe I need a little help here. So how do we get here? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So so you see, it's a 2-minute clip from 1990 in Rome during the World Cup. And you see, after a few seconds, the conductor, Zubin Mehta, stepping up here. And to his left is Placido Domingo, kind of the tenor. And so let me just... all right, so here in the center, down, bottom center, Zubin Mehta, to his left, Placido Domingo, a huge orchestra, actually composed of 2 different orchestras that, for the first time that night, performed together. So I know that some of you probably, if you put yourself into the shoes of the conductor, right? Some of you will be familiar with some of these dynamics, which is, there's the newly merged organization, right? So you need to somehow deal with this dynamic. Then, to his left, the superstar, somebody who is more equal than anyone else in the system. So that, he needs to deal with that dynamic. And then there's a huge audience kind of, having enormous expectation. So all these forces are pulling kind of this conductor in different directions. His job is to connect to these diverging field of forces and bring them together into a moment of peak performance. So as you watch that clip over the next 2 minutes, just put yourself in the shoes of the conductor and notice how he, with his listening, is kind of connecting with that field of actors, stakeholders, and partners around him. And then we'll kind of debrief it for a moment.
No puede ser una mujer malvada en su mirar como una luz singular. He visto que esa mujer es una desventurada. No puede ser una vulgar sirena que envenenó las horas de mi vida. No puede ser porque la vi rezar, porque la vi querer, porque la vi llorar. Los ojos que lloran no saben mentir, las malas mujeres no miran así, temblando en sus ojos dos lágrimas de mí, y a mí me ilusiona que tiemblen por mí. Que tiemblen por mí. Viva luz de mi ilusión, sé piadosa con mi amor, porque no sé fingir, porque no sé callar, porque no sé
So for the next minute, turn to your neighbor and share what you saw here. What just happened here? What did you notice? What did you notice in terms of that conductor connecting to the field, the ecosystem around him? 1 minute, one-on-one. Just turn to your neighbor. Observations.
With him, So please, if you want to bring in your voice online, kind of, or kind of here from the space, please just share 2 or 3 observations. So having watched the clip, what just happened here? What was the shift that you noticed? 2 or 3 observations.
A shift in leadership.
A shift in leadership. Be more specific. What did you notice?
The conductor, who usually has full command of the room, who knows how to play every instrument, right, is hearing everything, loses almost that control, and is overwhelmed by the tenor and these specific notes, and just concedes almost. I don't know if you can
There
see
is
the right
some
word.
element of letting go there, right? That we saw.
Yes.
Very good.
And both were, you know, I mean, and then he brought the orchestra back in, and it was very powerful closure.
All right, very good. I hope that was audible online. I think kind of the mics should do that. So what else? Excellent. Other observations, please.
I just noticed him, the conductor, just being very empathetic and being as if he's the tenor, feeling what the tenor is feeling, and really like listening from an empathetic point of view, and like
Empathetic with the the conductor, with the singer, with the others. You could see the emotional connection building up there, right?
Yep.
Yes. What else? Any other observations?
So he wasn't afraid of being seen as being in charge. He was happy to give someone else the stage for the benefit of the peak moment.
He was happy of pulling himself back a little bit and, allowing someone else other than himself moving center stage. Very important point.
I felt like a huge sense of responsibility at some point coming on the conductor, almost like if he was anticipating like an amazing moment coming.
Yes.
And he felt it is my responsibility to bring this together, and the conducting element, right? So I need to pay full attention to the opera singer so that I can command the room and bring them together.
So it's a moment of anticipation of something that's about to happen or that isn't quite there yet. Exactly, that's what we saw.
He also demonstrated a very visible body language and facial expressions to show the tenor as well as the orchestra that he was listening and he was there. He knew what was going on. So it was very evident he was communicating through his body language and facial expression.
Excellent. So I want to, there's a lot more we could unpack. So I just want to, underline a few things that you said and then show you the last 30, 40 seconds again, because most of the things that you mentioned happens in the final kind of stage of the clip. So we can verify everything that was said with our own observations when we watch it again. So just to point out kind of a few obvious things. The end of the clip, obviously very different from the beginning, right? In the beginning, it was kind of more this thing, and then in the end, it was really totally synchronized, right? Kind of totally in flow with each other. Kind of when you watch it in slow motion, you see the breathing is synchronized, the movements is synchronized. It's no longer two individuals interacting transactional. It's like one creative field manifesting through both or through all of them. Kind of you could see that shift happening. But the question for us, of course, is as leaders is, how actually did that happen, right? Because we know one state, the transactional stuff. We know kind of from certain experience the flow state. But how do you move from one to the other? And that's, of course, a lot of what leadership is about, right? And the reason why I show you this clip is because I'm not a musician. I don't really know really what's going on there. But as a facilitator, kind of as one who does professionally holding these spaces, I know exactly kind of what it looks like, feels like if you go with a team through this process, right? And a lot of the inner work that we have to do as leaders, as facilitators, we see embodied in the body language of the conductor, right? So I just want to remind you before showing it to you again. So it starts this, that's kind of the normal thing. Then at some point he is turning, right, to Placido, the arms wide open, and all the attention goes to Placido, and you see the emotional connection building up, right? So that's, I don't know whether that's visible, so that's kind of the second. And then here is
what happens in the last stage? So that's, you could say, where the empathy, kind of the third stage, is happening here, right? And so if we can switch the this camera thing around, so that's kind of the open heart. But then, so that's kind of the open heart. So here's the next thing what happens. Shortly after this happens, he is dropping the baton. Now, as a conductor, I get my paycheck for giving directions, right? So if I drop the baton, it's a radical statement. It's a radical statement that says it's not about me, it's not about my ego. It's about something else. Maybe it's Placido, but more precise would be the emerging moment of music that was just about to happen. So what he's doing is he's pulling himself out of the center, and he is holding the space for someone else or for something else to come into reality. So that emerging moment of music, and as you all know, kind of from any kind of creative process, what is it that happens at the beginning of a creative process?
Struggle.
Nothing. Yeah, struggle or nothing significant, because the creative breakthrough is arriving at its own schedule. So as a pro, what do? As a pro, you hold the space in anticipation, as you said, of what is to come. You hold the space, and then you begin to see that emerging moment of music beginning to land through Placido, and then you see the baton going back up, alerting the orchestra, it's about to happen, and then collectively they deliver kind of the final note. So that capacity, so obviously has nothing to do with downloading or with factual listening, or also not with empathy. It's a fourth stage, how we can connect with others, which has to do with holding the space for someone else and for something else that is about to happen, that's about to be born, and turning our own self into a vehicle for bringing this emerging new into reality as it desires. So that's kind of this fourth type of listening is what I call generative listening, or you could also call presencing, right? Kind of what Achim, presencing means sensing and actualizing an emerging future possibility. And that is, I believe, the most important capacity that we need as leaders, as network leaders, as change makers, when we deal with disruption kind of in this century. So let me quickly show you the last 30 seconds again, and then I will kind of wrap it up in the context of organizational change.
Viva luz de mi ilusión, sé piadosa con mi amor, porque no sé fingir, porque no sé callar, porque no sé
So what I basically have been saying is that the key for cross-sector leadership, and the key really for all great leadership today, resides to a significant degree in the capacity to move out of our own ecosystem bubble and to hold the space. So holding the space as the key capacity of leaders today for a constellation of other players. And it's only if we kind of are literate in this dimension of leadership, which is putting yourself out of the center, out of the ego center, and holding the space for others, only then we will be able to create real co-ownership among multiple stakeholders. Without that, you can just forget about everything. Because
You're the only owner, you have it on paper and you may have the budget, but nothing real is going to happen. When the budget is done, the impact is done. You all know that. So it's the key to all, the impact we are trying to have is creating this sense of shared ownership from a larger platform early on. And it has everything to do with the clip. You may ask yourself, well, why are we watching this weird music stuff, when we try to do real world things? Well, I believe it has everything to do. This deep capacity of listening is the key. Not the only one, but it's a key capacity we need to train. And if you build that, if you develop that, makes a huge difference in terms of creating this shared ownership among core groups, which then allows you to get traction. So let me give just a few examples, where that's a little bit illustrated. I know we are running late, so we improvise a little bit midway. But if that's okay with you, so let me run through that very quickly. How do you transfer that to organizational change? Well, usually we use a 5-stage process. So whether that's like a lab process, any kind of innovation or strategy reinvention, it goes through the 3 I already mentioned: observe, deep reflection, and then prototyping. But you do something before and something after. Before is bringing basically the co-initiation here, via bringing all the key stakeholders together and clarifying the shared intention. Then you move into the co-sensing, connecting to source, the prototyping, and then you integrate the key things that have been learned and scale them across the system. So I could give a bunch of different examples. Now, I'm sure you could, and many of you could as well. Let me jump. So yes, in this process, some of the key metrics and outcomes have to change. But let me jump to the more important piece, which is, what is the deeper shift that happens as a result, in addition to measurable outcomes that happens? And what really happens is a deeper shift in terms of how people communicate and how they relate to the system, right? So how the individual, a change maker, relates to the system. From a mindset that sees the system as something out there, to a mindset in which you see yourself being part of the system that you are dealing with. And when you move from here to here on the level of the individual, what do we call that? We call that reflection or mindfulness. When we move from here to here on the level of the collective, let's say a group, and the way we have conversations, we call that shift dialogue. So dialogue is not people talking to each other. Dialogue is the capacity of the system to see itself, which is at the same time the essence of systems thinking. From a theory U perspective, so what is theory U? It's basically awareness-based systems change. So it's a school of systems thinking that says the most important variable you need to change if you want to accomplish real change is a shift in consciousness, right? From ego to eco, from a silo to a systems view. So from a theory U perspective, we would say the essence of interventions, right, based on that methods, what do? They make the system sense and see itself. It's not only making the system see itself, but sense, because if you don't feel what other people feel, you have a broken, you have not really an integrated infrastructure that allows you to access collective creativity. So how do you do that? Well, number one, you create a shared context, right? A container that brings together all the different stakeholders. You go on these deep immersion learning journeys, right? Like here, listening to the Bajau people who live on sea, and listening to all the various stakeholders, and then you integrate, in the sense making, you integrate all these, discoveries from the various observe, sensing journeys through a method we call 4D mapping. I could talk, more about that later. A method in this case, that we call 3D mapping, where you map the system with objects, first current reality, then the emerging future. This is kind of the case of Alibaba. Same method, but larger stakeholder groups, kind of on sustainable food in Brazil, in Sao Paulo region, with 40 different organizations. Or you can also, in some cases, use scenario thinking as a method, kind of to integrate kind of these different. And we have done that in other cases. This is a picture from last week using what? The sea road simulation kind of out of the MIT System Dynamics group, and putting multi-stakeholder groups in a one-day simulator where they need to actually negotiate the climate deal. It's amazing what that does to the group, because all you do in terms of learning environment is you make visible, you close the feedback loop between their collective actions, the decisions they make, and what it does by 2100, right? What it does kind of in the next 80 years. And it's amazing kind of the mindset shift kind of that you see happening there. But the last thing, the main thing I want to talk about is how to bring these individual lab initiatives to scale, because that's the real challenge we have in all our systems. And that's kind of what I already started talking about earlier. So ULabX kind of as like an experiment to blend the massive democratization access to knowledge that we have with MOOCs, massive open online courses, with activating the deep learning cycle. And what we saw there is that around the world in 600 different places, we saw hubs forming, place-based communities where people move through this 7-week, 7-step process, going basically through the entire U process in a 2-month period, based, in a self-organized way, but supported by a digital platform and supported by, peer-to-peer learning mechanisms. So these are a few pictures from some of the hubs, kind of in Chengdu. The Impact Hub community played a big role with over 40 hubs. This is the Scottish government using ULab as an activation mechanism for bottom-up innovation. And we also learned that we can engage the entire community, as kind of a global body of, of knowledge, as a globally distributed community for knowledge creation. So we put this chart in front of them, which is the one-page summary of TUU. So the 4 levels of systems: individual, group, organization, and larger systems. And here are the 4 levels of consciousness, right? From same old, habitual action to deep co-creativity, what we saw on the clip. So it has the 4 levels of listening, conversation, and then other things. So we asked people, where do you act today? And here's what they said. Today, most of us in that global community of change makers, tens of thousands, are acting on level 1, 2, or 3. Next question, given the challenges that you face today, where should you be acting? 90% said level 4. Then we said, wait a minute, how come? So that's what you should be doing, but here's what you really do. What's holding you back from operating from this deeper level, kind of more distributed, collective, co-creative? Give us your response, what's holding you back, with just 3 words. And here's what they said. Greed, fear, ignorance. At the end of that 7-week cycle, we said, all right, now you have connected more with what you really want to make happen in your professional, personal life. Tell us, what would it take if you really would, would seriously commit to making that happen? Courage, courage, and courage. Last question, if you would commit yourself to actually making that happen, what's the support you need from others to actually follow through? And here's what they said. Love, listening, trust, which is a very interesting list because it's totally scalable. It's totally organizable, kind of, if we kind of organize our communities in intelligent ways. So we had in the exit survey, in this kind of globally, about a third who talked about life-changing experiences. So let me go back to the beginning. And so I started with the question, what does it take to address this issue that we face in many different forms today? And what I basically said is three things. One, it takes a process. Two, it takes inner leadership work. And three, it takes a supporting infrastructure that allows us to create an amplification mechanism for all the positive seeds that are already existing here that can kind of more balance what's already happening up here in terms of amplification. And so that basically helps us to move from reacting to the symptoms of problems to addressing more kind of the source, the root issues. And the way we prototype these infrastructures is innovation labs, capacity building mechanisms, and research. So the innovation labs, focus on upgrading the operating system in the system that we are dealing with. So that's basically what we mean with ego to eco shift. So if you look at systems today, you see all over the place the same development from an old operating system, input and authority-centric 1.0, like in health, traditional doctor-centric or learning teacher-centric models, to the 2.0 output and efficiency-centric, evidence-based medicine, teaching for testing or bulimia learning, to the good school, which is 3.0, outcome and user-centric. So it's patient-centric medicine, it's learner or student-centric schools. But that's not the end of the story. So that's kind of the good school today. What do we see tomorrow? The next stage. 4.0 in terms of co-creative or ecosystem-centric, which in the case of health is not only addressing the issues of sickness, but strengthening the sources of health, which is 80% of our sources of health. It's only 20% in the old healthcare system. So it's moving to that approach. And the same with learning, right? Not only smarter ways of dealing with the old curriculum, it's really activating the deeper sources of learning and creativity that our children will need to deal with the disruptive changes in this century. And the same could be said in the evolution of finance from traditional to extractive, capital externality blind, impact investing, externality aware, but often not changing the systemic structure. So like generative capital, which is addressing the deeper systemic structures. Now, what does that require from management? The evolution of the opening of the dome that I showed to you in the other video clip, right? From the old dome to ecosystem, right? Kind of breathing in and breathing out, kind of activating the larger ecosystem around. That, of course, is embedded in an evolution of capitalism that we can't address here. So that's what we mean with upgrading the operating system from 2 and 3.0 to 4.0, which you only can do together. And that's where we need convening power, right? For example, from UN institutions, kind of to bring the key innovators together. We need massive capacity building mechanisms like ULab or other forms kind of that, build these capacities at scale. And of course we need, research, right? And then, I mentioned the HuffPost platform that will launch in March, where we'll have monthly live sessions where we will form place-based communities and we'll basically develop a hybrid between capacity building and movement building. So encouraging citizens to other multi-sector initiatives to form their own initiatives, and then we'll come together in live sessions and in global forums event make that happen. So that's basically what we are trying to do. I'm sorry to going a little bit over time here. I will share the slides on my own homepage. It's probably already posted. And we are really excited in being with you in conversation. at this moment, because we as a, like, an experimental platform that is kind of has been exploring the space of multi-sector innovation, A, and B, how can you bring that to scale? We feel that we are in a moment where something like that is, what we did on a very small scale in a few places, where that is required really at a much larger scale today. And that's exactly the space kind of where you are also innovating in. So we are very interested in, finding out what we can learn from each other, how we can help each other, and how we maybe also in some places can also more intentionally work together. Thank you very much.
Otto, if I can just indulge you for one moment, one question from our colleagues online. I think it's a good one to almost bring some of these issues and some of these ideas together. How to foster that culture of experimentation and learning and sensing in the UN, and how would you see, what would you advise and suggest that we can create that space that is safe, how to keep that safe for the system? So how do you make it safe to fail?
Yeah, so how to, I think there's like two approaches to change. One is kind of, you change, is the old cascading top-down, right, changing the whole system. And the other one is basically more like you go with the energy, right? So if the future is already there, you align yourself with where people already operate in this way, more or less. And I think that would be probably, you probably need a little bit of structural reform. I heard that's already underway, so you don't need to worry about that. That's probably not helping a lot. I think the other piece is, we know that structural change only can go so far, right? The real issue is not the hardware. It's kind of the mindset that with that we operate, be that the old or the new structures. So I would say, how do you create the space? You align, you place your attention, and you in your own sphere of influence, kind of, you try to identify the places where the future is already there, where these kind of collaborative opportunities are already manifest or could be made manifest, because the old way of operating is just so dysfunctional that it's not acceptable to continue that. So I think, and start with a few, start with few steps. Don't be too overly ambitious. I think, focus some of these initiatives, or maybe also groups, and then go with where these initiatives need support. I also think that it could be, so if there's like, when I have seen other organizations do successful change, it often has to do with giving resources and empowerment and capacity building to people who are more remote from headquarters, right, the field, people who are younger, and also people who in general are more at the edge of the system. So I would say the place, so when I talk to people in the UN, I often, and I think you guys are just in an amazing space, and the complexity is just unparalleled. But what's the downside of that, being in such a big organization? That sometimes you think, you over-attend to what's inside your organization, or the UN organization, and under-attend to all the stakeholders outside. I think that's less the case when you're in the country organizations, in the field, right? So that's just, I would attend to these other stakeholders, because the more you can go to the interface where the UN system is directly connecting with these other, not only the host country government, but also the other sectors there, I think that's where you have a very fertile ground to get traction very soon, particularly real-world traction in terms of the 17 SDGs. So I would, really figure out where are kind of these high-impact opportunities
and it tends to be usually more at the edges of the system, not in the center. So the more young, the more remote, the more at the edges where you work across sectors or need to learn to work across sectors. And I personally find it a lot easier. Let's say kind of, I work in academia, like MIT, right? So you could say UN is difficult, right? Reforming academia is hopeless, right? So that's like, so I know some of these. So when is it that I'm much more likely to collaborate with my colleagues from other departments? When I deal with a shared client, right? So you have all these competitive genes across the agencies going on. Yeah, that's just reality. But when is it that you can trigger the collaborative genes, that you can strengthen them? In the face of the client, in the face of the community, in the face of the real world issues that need all of these agencies to collaborate in order to be effective. That's your most powerful partner. So I would invest stuff where you bring this third variable in. So don't try to fix the UN by only putting UN people together. That's hopeless. You need to bring in the real reality from on the ground, from the other sectors, because A, it will have more impact, and B, it is much easier then to connect across agencies, because you know why, because you see it with your own eyes. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Otto. Any questions from the room before we wrap up? Otto, thank you very much. On behalf of, I just want to, and really thank you for your time, and just connecting to what you said at the end, is to expand and stretch the space we bring in to have those conversations and those dialogues outside of the UN system, and connecting with individuals from academia with great ideas and important insights that we can take forward in our own thinking and how we approach collaboration within the system. I think this is beyond dogmatic ways of engaging in partnerships and inquiry, but really helping us bring that future we want or aspire to into the present. And how can we do that more effectively? And particularly those colleagues and our leaders on the ground we have online, and hopefully are still there depending on the time zone they're in, to help them take them through and create the space and stretch those boundaries for that conversation and dialogue. We do plan to take that forward and create that collaborative space and bring some of these ideas to them within a lab environment, but at the very least through these series where we can get and prime their understanding and get them to start thinking about how to do things better and do development better in different ways. So thank you very much, and thank you colleagues for attending. And thank you all those online. And we do look forward to, I don't know where I'm looking, I think there, so there. We do look forward to keeping in touch with you and hosting more of these as podcasts, and they'll be available for colleagues across the system. So with that, I close the first LEADX event. Thank you.
All right, thank you.